Where is the U.S. in this? Where is the U.K.? And is there a danger that these old Western economies actually fall behind in rebuilding better and quicker?
Yeah, it's exactly to prevent this kind of falling behind from all economies that we're working on this method of looking at the 11 key priorities for economic transformation. It's become so cliche to talk about we must have economies be more inclusive and more sustainable, and that is correct. But what are the actual policy priorities we should then focus on? How do you make these things endogenous to economic growth in the future rather than simply dealing with the after effects of planetary degradation or inequality? So that's what we're trying to do. In terms of the United Kingdom, the UK does fairly well in terms of having put in place some of the priorities around the energy transition. It does fairly well in terms of social safety nets. It does fairly well in terms of developing labor laws for the future, but that's all based on today's data against these future priorities. In terms of the United States, it does fairly well in terms of having put in place investments for the markets of tomorrow. So really investing with the public sector and the private sector into greener energy, into markets related to edtech and reskilling, into space exploration, et cetera. So all of these things that are needed in the future, but lagging behind very much when it comes to social safety nets, lagging behind in terms of reforming education, lagging behind in terms of the green energy transition, and lagging behind in terms of antitrust laws. So there's a number of areas where, as you said, the advanced economies, Western economies in particular, need to think differently if they want to remain competitive in the future.
Saadia, you keep on talking about reviving and transforming, and I wonder when the perfect timeline for that is. Is it when you're still in the crisis, even in the middle of lockdown? Because if you wait too long, then you miss the boat.
Yeah, I mean, if some of these measures are not put in place now, we ossify the structures that exist today. We kind of ossify the market concentration that has grown, we ossify the inequality that's growing, and we basically make it much harder to deal with environmental sustainability in the future. So this is very much the moment, and we sort of look at two timeframes. There's a reaction to the crisis, certainly, but then there's a revival phase, and that's the next 1 to 2 years. And then there's the economic transformation phase, which is the next 3 to 5 years out. And we lay that out, what you need to do today, which most governments are doing already, and then what needs to happen over the course of the next 5 years.
Saadia, Tom Keene in New York, wonderful to have you with us. I've got like 8 questions, as always, off your report. And one of them is that time of year, which we're not doing, where I talked to the World Economic Forum about a panel. To fold into your competitiveness, to me, it's about the pandemic partition. And whether it's your Pakistan or the United States of America, there seems to be a massive competition partition between the haves and the have-nots of this pandemic. How are we going to close that, not nation to nation, but within a given nation, if it's the challenges of Pakistan or the challenges of America?
Oh, no, absolutely. When we looked at the shorter term, it was very clear that the economies that were relatively resilient were the ones that had already invested in digitizing their economies. And within countries, there's huge amounts of polarization. To your point, there's a huge amount of the haves and the have-nots along the digital divide within a country like Pakistan or within a country like the United States, and then, of course, across countries. So the next big phase of recovery, and in fact, that's one of the 11 areas of transformation that we point out, there has to be greater digital infrastructure available to everyone. And that really does mean everyone, because without that, people are simply not going to be ready for the new economy.
This is a sort of a philosophical question. I'm going to go to your Smith College economics on this. Do we go back to our Lockean individualism in the Western world? Or is this pandemic enough where we actually shift to what Klaus Schwab talks about, which is a more inclusive social safety net?
I think we have no choice but to do that. As the pandemic has just shown us, we are only ever going to be as good as sort of the weakest link in the chain. And so if this pandemic exists anywhere, it's actually everywhere. And so when it comes to vaccine dissemination, when it comes to debt relief, there will need to be much greater coordination from advanced economies. And I think what we saw in 2020 is that there was a lot more of that national inward-looking focus, global cooperation was missing.
Right.
But in this next stage, there's no choice but to return to a form of global cooperation and multilateralism.